Germans found the M1 Garand in shattered French lanes, where broken carts and abandoned helmets lined the ditches. They offered little curiosity at first, assuming the Americans carried another ordinary rifle, but as they examined the captured weapon, they ran their fingers over the smooth walnut stock, noting the unusual internal magazine. 8 rounds sat inside, ready to fire without the clumsy break in pace they knew so well from bolt-action rifles. The men exchanged glances while a lieutenant scribbled notes, impressed that a soldier could keep his cheek welded to the sight picture and keep firing. German armourers measured the weight, studied the gas system, and shook their heads because no one in their camps enjoyed that mechanical advantage. The rifle felt heavy, but the balance made it lively, and there were rumours of Americans firing without pause, sending bullets faster than any Mauser could. Some German infantrymen, still smelling cordite, muttered that the weapon seemed too quick to be fair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Americans had believed in fire superiority, and now the Germans understood why. In training manuals, soldiers practiced a rhythm of bolt manipulation, charging with muscle memory. But the Garand's semi-automatic action meant no bolt handle to grab, no momentary delay, only trigger pressure measuring the seconds. German testers fired, feeling the mechanical bark. The rifle cycled smoothly, sending brass flying. A corporal compared it to an automaton, brief and loud, repeating with little effort. 8 shots sang from the barrel in a quick tempo, leaving the corporal fascinated by how little thought was needed between rounds. Reports claimed that American riflemen laid down fire that felt like squads. The Germans smelled proof. The captured sample demonstrated that a single American soldier could equal the rate of multiple men with bolt actions. Commanders studying the battlefield complained how patrols absorbed suppressive fire quickly, and platoons in hedgerows were halted cold, bewildered by the rapid succession of shots. The Garand remained simple to maintain too. Its finish shrugged off grime, and the gas piston stayed reliable even after mud clung to metal. The weapon invited confidence. The 8-round en-bloc clip surprised them. Soldiers used internal magazines or detachable boxes, not this curious metal piece. Germans discovered that the clip ejected with a distinct ping after the last round. They debated the sound, some believing it gave away positions. Others thought battlefield chaos masked it. True or not, the clip ensured that reloading stayed simple. Insert, press, and continue. In trenches, that meant survival when seconds counted. German testers noticed the speed, poking the mechanism until they admitted its efficiency. They confronted a fact that Americans had engineered something remarkably balanced. Fast, rugged, accurate enough to matter in long lanes of combat. In instruction halls, German officers concluded that their infantry's tempo lacked the Garand's pace. Training schools taught method, discipline, and bolt cycles. But here was a weapon reshaping infantry doctrine. No wonder advancing American units felt like storms crashing through hedgerows. As the Allies approached deeper into France, German units found themselves overwhelmed. Eyewitness accounts described squads pinned behind stone walls, afraid to peek. Rifles were meant to exchange deliberate shots. Instead, battles swallowed them in deafening bursts. In late summer, a group of German evaluators gathered near a workshop. They disassembled the rifle, placing pins and springs onto cloth. One armour master marvelled at the gas system. It took propellant energy, cycled the action, and returned control to the shooter with little fuss. The soldier spent more, time focusing on the target, not mechanics. Compared to the dependable but slower Carabiner 98K, this system yielded continuous fire. Another technician tested reliability using dusty cartridges. The rifle still fired cleanly. Observations spread among officers. Fire superiority became a threat not only in doctrine but daily survival. American riflemen used their weapons like extensions of will. Crossing roads or climbing hills, they knew that they could sustain fire without wasting seconds. Germans believed that machine guns dictated infantry pace, but now riflemen approached that level. Stories circulated about soldiers who reacted faster than snipers. They simply raised rifles, fired several shots, and controlled kill zones. It changed patrol dynamics. German files recorded incidents where engagements lasted moments, with entire patrols halted by a lone rifleman. In conversations around stoves, soldiers bemoaned that this rifle gave Americans unfair leverage. Young recruits wondered if better training compensated for slower rifles. But older veterans knew that raw skill couldn't overcome mechanical deficits. A well-aimed volley required time. The Garand took that away. Some suggested issuing more submachine guns. Yet, ammunition demands troubled supply officers. Meanwhile, the Garand blended range and volume. The Germans whispered among themselves. If the Americans provided this to every infantryman, they prepared armies for relentless advance. Across occupied territories, resistance fighters mentioned Americans carried rifles spitting bullets rapidly. German intelligence dismissed these claims as exaggeration. Now, physical evidence sat in their workshops. Their commanders wrote urgent notes, requesting research into similar systems. Engineers examined geometry, blueprinting gas operations, but wartime strain and industrial pressure left little room for redesign. They lacked time to inject new rifles into the field, leaving soldiers to meet semi-automatic fire with bolt-action resolve. Frontline diaries revealed panic among small units. In the Ardennes, patrols noted that American rifle squads created illusions of larger forces. Germans hesitated to probe, fearing machine guns but discovering only riflemen wielding Garands. The psychological effect mattered. On gloomy mornings, fog concealed muzzle flashes, and the rhythm of 8 shots echoed through trees. German soldiers braced. Assaults faltered because no one wished to charge against men who fired without pause. Germans recognized that every soldier could lay suppressive fire. In training yards, they timed sequences, comparing bolt-action cycling to semi-automatic rhythm. The difference felt stark. Though Carabiner 98K remained accurate, rate of fire set the tempo. When engagements closed to short ranges, the Garand thrived. German manuals emphasized rapid bolt cycling, yet stress slowed hands. Dirt, cold, and fear impeded motion. Semi-automatic design helped Americans maintain efficiency. No wonder villages fell quickly once Americans pressed attacks. Captured field notes from American officers highlighted emphasis on marksmanship and continuous fire. German analysts agreed that doctrine intertwined with equipment. One without the other faltered. Garand training drilled reloads with muscle memory, bridging downtime. That meant squads kept firing until enemies broke. Germans complained that their men, reloading manually, gave opportunities for counterfire. Americans denied those windows. They preferred momentum. Stories described engagements in hedgerows where Garand owners moved like fluid shadows. Germans, expecting pauses, misjudged timing. Shots continued, driving them to ground. A single squad might feel like a platoon. Mortar crews hesitated. They strained to pinpoint threats but found riflemen, not emplacements. The weapon blurred infantry hierarchy. American soldiers felt emboldened because firepower gave confidence. They believed in victory because rifles made them feel invincible. Engineers measuring barrel harmonics nodded at the craftsmanship. Walnut blended with steel, giving stability and reducing felt recoil. Continuous firing remained controlled. German marksmen admitted grudging respect, knowing that follow-up shots required little correction. That meant fewer misses. And when misses occurred, subsequent rounds arrived instantly. The battlefield tasted different. Noise dominated. Bolt clicks no longer punctuated calm moments. Instead, fire raged steadily. A historian later wrote that Garands turned common soldiers into formidable adversaries. Germans holding villages learned this truth painfully. A firefight might begin with cautious probing, then erupt in thunder. Americans advanced confidently behind rifle volleys, flanking defenders. Machine guns bristled but faced consistent pressure. Once positions cracked, Americans forced retreats. German fields became stages for fast battles that favored rhythm over ritual. When Germans gathered prisoners, they sometimes asked about the rifles. Soldiers smiled, saying the weapons served faithfully. They described long marches, sudden firefights, and the reassuring weight in their hands. Germans wondered what factories birthed them. They imagined assembly lines producing these marvels in quantities too large to thwart. Industrial might married with clever design, that combination spelt doom for defenders. Training commanders considered copying the design. However, factories already strained under war demands. Creating new rifles proved impossible. They relied on existing arsenals. Occasional prototypes emerged, but none matched Garand's simplicity and durability. Some soldiers dreamed of scavenging captured rifles. But ammunition logistics complicated usage. Rarely did units standardize such practice. In time, stories of the clip's ping echoed through ranks. Some Germans believed that after hearing it, Americans became vulnerable. Yet, actual accounts varied. Chaos drowned subtle tones. For every tale of brave soldiers charging after a ping, there were numerous instances where no one noticed. Regardless, the rifle's presence continued reshaping combat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Reports estimated that the Americans fielded countless Garands. Entire divisions equipped with semi-automatics terrified planners. They mapped scenarios where rifle squads seized initiative almost instantly. Defensive positions, depending on predictable firing rhythms, would crumble. The Americans anticipated this, pushing doctrine that stressed continuous forward pressure. Germans defended stubbornly but could not match tempo. Weather tested reliability. In cold forests, Garands maintained cycling. Bolt actions froze occasionally, demanding extra care. Snow and sleet hampered movements, yet semi-automatic function persisted. Soldiers appreciated that reliability. They trusted their rifles, focusing on missions rather than mechanical anxiety. That confidence carried into brutal winter clashes. By contrast, Germans nurtured their rifles, attending bolts meticulously. Misfires drained morale. Under fire, small delays magnified. The Garand disguised fatigue because muscle and metal shared burdens. Continuous fire cost less physical effort. German riflemen envied that. They preferred deliberate shots, but circumstances favored those who fired fast and often. Morale eroded. Units initially believed that discipline and tactics outweighed mechanical differences, yet repeated encounters shattered illusions. Defensive perimeters felt porous. The Garand carved holes with its tempo. Germans retreated to woods, hoping terrain offset disadvantages. Trees, though, offered little protection. Americans aimed through gaps, sending shots rapidly. Patrols avoided open ground. Cultural pride endured, yet soldiers recognized engineering truth. Americans had gifted each infantryman a miniature storm. Dust rose from hedgerow berms, shells tumbled, and within the mayhem, rifle volleys created certainty. When divisions advanced, Garands provided backbone. Machine guns still mattered, but rifles no longer felt secondary. They controlled storylines. Historians claimed that in fields thick with smoke, Germans often imagined multiple machine guns firing. Later, they learned it had been rifle squads. This revelation unsettled even veterans. Bolt-action pacing belonged to past wars. The future belonged to semi-automatics. Yet Germany lacked time to embrace change. They fought valiantly, but weapons shaped fate. Even as tide turned, Germans kept studying. They admired mechanical elegance. The Garand's simplicity taught lessons about reliability. Fewer moving parts meant fewer failures. Gas system cleanliness ensured consistent cycling. Stocks withstood abuse. Metal endured cold. That synergy made the pack a rifle beloved. On quieter nights, soldiers cleaned their rifles under lantern light. They wondered how Americans received such tools in vast numbers. In trenches, captured Garands sat on racks. Some joked about their weight, others praised feel. Regardless, They acknowledged that Americans had invested in every infantryman. Final battles confirmed anxiety, firestorms erupted, and Americans charged fearlessly. The Garand rang out, 8 shots, reload, 8 more. German soldiers crouched, fearing relentless volleys. They peeked and saw silhouettes with rifles raised steadily. The battlefield harmonized to their rhythm. No predictable pauses, no comforting lulls, only ceaseless fire pressing forward. In the winter of 1943, as the frozen winds scraped across the shattered crossroads outside Kharkiv, the German soldiers who had stumbled upon the captured American rifle still whispered about its mechanical mystery. Rumors about the strange weapon had already circulated, spreading from trenches to command tents. And now, part 2 of this tale opens with the weapon resting on a makeshift table, its walnut stock scratched but noble. The German quartermaster, Oberfeldwebel Krüger, leaned over it with measured curiosity, his gloved hands tracing the metal contours while the cold clung to the air like a silent spectator. Behind him, Lieutenant Schaefer stood ready, locking his gaze on the rifle that had fired with astonishing speed during the last skirmish. The two men traded cautious glances, unable to ignore the remarkable reality before them. The previous night, Lieutenant Schaefer and his squad had brought the M1 Garand from a skirmish near a recaptured Soviet farmhouse. They had lost 2 men, and in the darkness the shadow of an American patrol disappeared like ghosts. Yet the real prize was this semi-automatic rifle. At first glance, it looked rugged and oddly refined, neither as crude as the Russian Mosin, nor as familiar as their standard K98K. Schaefer remembered how the American who carried it fired rapidly, 8 shots in quick succession, as though he were wielding a light machine gun rather than a simple infantry rifle. This memory would haunt him throughout the night. In the cold morning daylight, Krüger and Schaefer began disassembling the rifle, checking the gas system, and passing around the N-block clip. They were astonished by the smoothness, the precision, and the forward-thinking mechanism. The Germans prided themselves on engineering excellence, yet this device, mass-produced and issued broadly, felt ahead of its time. When Schaefer clipped the metal packet into place and pushed down, the metallic click resonated like a promise. 8 rounds ready to fire, without the interruption of bolt manipulation. It was unlike any rifle doctrine they'd known. The German analysis team arrived soon after. A Waffenamt officer, Herr Dr. Albrecht Rössler, strode in from a covered truck, brushing snow from his coat. He had analyzed Soviet designs, Italian sidearms, and even captured Czech prototypes. Yet he had never seen a rifle that embodied cutting-edge mass production without sacrificing battlefield efficiency. Rössler ran his gloved finger along the rifle's rear sight, carefully lifting the aperture. He noted its adjustability. With a twist, a soldier could compensate for range without fiddling too long, granting significant accuracy at distance. They conducted firing tests behind the barn. The rifle barked with steady rhythm, like a small machine gun in disciplined hands. Cartridges flew, and the rifle cycled unfailingly. No bottleneck fumbling, no bolt throw or awkward repositioning. Schaefer, who normally excelled with the K98K, felt liberated. He squeezed the trigger and watched targets fall. He could maintain an almost continuous sight picture. The weapon felt alive. When the 8th round fired, the famous ping echoed, a cheerful little tone that brought brief smiles despite the grimness of war. As tests continued, they compared recoil. The semi-automatic action soaked some of the kick, helping the shooter stay on target. In contrast, the K98K's stout recoil pushed shoulders back, demanding readjustment. Such subtlety mattered. German infantry squads depended heavily on their machine gunners to carry the firepower, while riflemen mainly supported. But this American design gave every infantryman a taste of automatic dominance. The idea unsettled them. They began to understand why Allied reports claimed Americans had overwhelming firepower. It was not just machine guns, even their rifles were formidable. They returned indoors to make notes. Rössler wondered how the Americans manufactured so many rifles with such uniformity. He knew the German industrial system was strained, competing demands, strategic bombing, and limited resources. Even if they could copy the mechanism, they might never field millions. They studied the gas cylinder, the operating rod, and the robust bolt. There were no complicated machining quirks. The design aimed for reliability over artistry. In contrast, German weapons often prioritized precision craftsmanship, which slowed production. That night, around a dim lamp, the discussion turned philosophical. Schaefer recalled his first engagement against Americans in Tunisia. He remembered hearing strange reports of rapid rifle fire. They had dismissed it, assuming multiple machine guns. Now he realized it could have been mere handfuls of infantrymen. He felt a mix of frustration and awe. Kruger shared stories of the Eastern Front, where Soviet troops often attacked in waves. The M1 Garand could break such attacks more efficiently, delivering sustained fire with minimal effort. At dawn, snow fell softly. The Germans gathered the rifle parts again, testing the mechanism in sub-zero temperatures. Even with chill-biting metal, the action moved freely. Their own rifles, though rugged, could become stiff and sluggish. The Garand remained almost cheerful. The sturdy wood stock resisted the humidity, and machined internals seemed perfectly fitted for harsh weather. They wondered how American soldiers perceived this gift. Did they know how lucky they were? They arranged target drills, pairing the captured rifle against the K98K. Schaefer demonstrated both weapons. With the K98K, each shot demanded a cycle of the bolt. It broke rhythm. With the Garand, shots flowed like a river. The test group timed it. Schaefer could deliver 8 accurate shots in less time than 3 with the K98K. The realization shocked them. This meant that one American rifleman had firepower equivalent to several German soldiers during the crucial opening seconds of combat. The barn door opened briefly, letting in a blast of wind and 3 more officers. They had heard stories and wanted to witness the weapon. Rössler explained the findings: semi-automatic action, en-bloc clip, adjustable sights, reliable gas system. One officer frowned, skeptically. But after firing the rifle himself, he nodded slowly. The rifle jolted him with its simplicity and power. He had never imagined that an ordinary infantryman could wield such a tool. After days of study, they carefully repackaged the rifle for transport to a research facility. Orders came from above: prioritize analysis, explore potential adaptation, and consider integrating semi-automatic concepts into German production. Yet, there was skepticism. The German armaments industry struggled to keep up with simpler demands. They lacked the capacity to produce millions of such rifles without sacrificing other priorities. Still, the weapon haunted them. Around campfires, soldiers retold exaggerated stories of American sharpshooters firing endlessly without pause. The Garand achieved mythical status. The sight of its smooth action, metal and wood harmonizing, became a symbol of the industrial advantage possessed by the United States. German soldiers mused about battles that might have turned differently if they too had wielded such rifles. On the front lines, whenever the hiss of incoming American rifle fire filled the air, the Germans now assumed the worst. They imagined dozens of Garands blazing. Actual encounters reinforced this fear. Patrols reported that the Americans consistently fired faster, hitting targets even while moving. The psychological weight was profound. German troops began approaching forested areas with extra caution, knowing that a single American squad could unleash unexpected fury. Meanwhile, back at the research lab, engineers attempted to study the Garand's manufacturing steps. They admired the heat treatment and material choice, but wartime pressures demanded shortcuts. Some blueprints were drafted, yet nothing progressed beyond prototypes. The G43 rifle, introduced earlier, seemed promising, but it lacked the rugged reliability of the Garand. Its fragility under combat use proved a glaring weakness. Field reports confirmed that the Garand remained superior. In time, Whispers spread through the German army. Captured Garands were prized trophies. Elite units occasionally used them in battle, appreciating their advantages. One paratrooper, Feldwebel Meyer, carried a Garand during a fierce skirmish near Monte Cassino. His squad, low on ammunition and outnumbered, defended a ruined chapel. Meyer fired swiftly, picking targets with ease. His men watched, half in admiration and half in disbelief. The rifle's bark kept enemy heads down, buying precious time. Later, when they narrowly escaped encirclement, Meyer credited the weapon with saving their lives. Stories like Meyer's circulated widely. Though logistics made widespread use impossible, these tales nurtured a strange respect for the enemy's craftsmanship. German soldiers remained proud of their traditions, but they acknowledged the practicality of the American approach. Every captured Garand reinforced this lesson. By early 1944, as the war's tide shifted, German analysts revisited their notes. They compared the Garand to new automatic rifles emerging across Europe. None balanced reliability, accuracy, and rate of fire so elegantly. The German leadership recognized that they were witnessing the future of infantry arms. Despite the admiration, some officers downplayed the weapon's significance, clinging to doctrine that emphasized machine guns. Yet younger soldiers, who felt the pressure of modern combat, viewed the Garand as a glimpse of what could have been. They understood that valor alone could not bridge the technological gap. Months later, as American forces pressed into France, the Garand became ever more common on battlefields. German defenders heard its steady crack across hedgerows and urban ruins. The rhythmic semi-automatic cadence struck fear. Veterans learned to identify it instantly. They warned new recruits to respect it. Even when German snipers sought to counter the threat, the Garand's quick follow-up shots made duels risky. The Americans seemed always ready. A sniper who missed his first shot often found himself under return fire before he could relocate. This accelerated tempo altered tactics. In closing, the German investigation into the M1 Garand changed minds. What began as curiosity evolved into admiration and anxiety. The weapon symbolized industrial might, tactical foresight, and a new paradigm of infantry warfare. Although the Germans developed their own semi-automatic rifles, none achieved the same balance. The M1 Garand remained a quiet conqueror, reshaping countless encounters. As soldiers on both sides learned, technology and design could shape destiny more than bravado or ideology. As spring approached, reports came from Normandy, describing firefights where American infantry used their Garands to lay down precise cascading fire against German positions. In hedgerow battles, where every second mattered, the semi-automatic advantage translated into survival. German squads attempted flanking maneuvers, but sustained American fire disrupted their timing. Veterans recalled the distinctive ping that marked an empty clip, yet many noted that the sound was easily lost amid chaos. At a forward observation post near Saint-Lô, a captured corporal explained how his unit feared the weapon's psychological impact. He claimed that even hearing rapid shots signaled a well-prepared enemy. German commanders revised training materials, emphasizing caution. Some instructed their riflemen to conserve ammunition and coordinate more closely with machine gunners, hoping to compensate for the slower K-98K. Still, whispers persisted that nothing could match the Garand's blend of firepower and reliability. In the Ardennes, during the brutal winter of 1944, German troops encountered American units entrenched among snow-covered pines. The silent woods erupted with fast, controlled rifle fire. German diaries from that period describe panic when patrols faced sudden volleys. One entry recounted 2 men who fled after believing they faced a heavy machine gun, only to learn that a handful of riflemen had defended the position. The revelation stunned them. The Garand, again, proved itself more than a rifle. It was a force multiplier that turned ordinary soldiers into formidable opponents. Even after the war, those who handled the Garand spoke with reverence. Some German veterans admitted that, had they wielded such rifles earlier, certain battles might have taken different paths. The weapon's legacy endured, symbolizing a turning point. It taught nations that infantry arms must combine simplicity, durability, and rapid fire. The M1 Garand set the standard, inspiring designs across continents. Its impact transcended borders, reminding all who studied it that innovation often determines the course of history. Its legend lives on. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We, prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. The morning tasted of metal and fear. Our officers gathered maps on crude tables, drawing arrows toward enemy lines. I watched mechanics patch bullet holes with trembling hands. Each man carried a story of smoke, of engines dying mid-sky, of friends who never returned. Yet orders were orders. We would fly again. We prepared with cold resolve. As engines roared to life, I remembered the fields of home, where wheat swayed without fear. I promised myself that if I survived this day, I would write to my mother about the sunrise that dared to bloom above the war. The briefing echoed. Hold formation. Trust your wingman. Our leader, face carved by years of sorties, reminded us that courage was not absence of fear, but flight despite trembling. We taxied forward, hearts beating like frantic drums. The runway shimmered, a thin path between life and memory. I whispered a prayer, neither to win nor to conquer, but simply to return. Above, the sky opened like a chapter still unwritten, and we rose, carrying every name etched in our hearts. Clouds gathered like silent witnesses as we climbed. The radio cracked with static, then with voices calm, precise, rehearsed. I saw my reflection in the canopy, eyes older than my years. Far below, villages slept in fragile peace. Somewhere, children dreamed of summer, unaware that the sky bore machines of fire. My wingman tapped his controls, a small gesture of trust. I carried that trust like armor. Ahead, the horizon darkened where enemy patrols awaited. Hunters and hunted bound by fate. We accelerated, engines singing a hymn of defiance. Our formation tightened, held. We sought courage in silence, believing that in chaos we could find our way home. Dawn broke quietly over the ruined French ridge, thin mist crawling between craters where wild grass still fought to exist. The German detail, weary from weeks of constant retreat, had decided that today would be different. They no longer sought victory. They sought understanding. The M1 Garand, wrapped in worn cloth and guarded like treasure, now served as the centerpiece of their IK. Final inquiry. Since seizing it, they had tested every component, marveling at its endurance, baffled by its elegance. And yet, questions lingered. How had the Americans produced so many? How had they trained millions to use such complex machinery with casual expertise? The officers gathered near a small stone church that still stood despite shattered windows. Inside, pews lay broken, hymnals littered the floor. The rifle leaned against an altar, sunlight cut through dust, glinting against steel, and dragging every German eye toward its quiet presence. Oberleutnant Schaefer felt the weight of history inside his veins. This rifle seemed to symbolize everything their army struggled to comprehend. Strength, simplicity, mass production, hope. They recounted stories from Normandy. American squads advancing with relentless rhythm, 8 rounds singing in controlled bursts. German riflemen, trained on a doctrine of steady single shots, found themselves overwhelmed. Machine gunners, the backbone of German infantry, now faced riflemen who delivered near-automatic fire. The tactics blurred, battlefields blurred, the distinctions between elite and common dissolved. Schaefer placed his hand on the stock, feeling its warmth. He remembered a night ambush near Carentan. Rain poured like judgment. The sound of rapid fire erupted from hedgerows. His men fired back, but the American squad maintained tempo, forcing his soldiers to break and dodge. The memory haunted him. Had they wielded these rifles, perhaps they would have held the road. Perhaps his best friend would still be alive. Their current position was quiet but tense. The German High Command demanded continued analysis. Rumors whispered that the Americans had already improved beyond the M1, yet no one believed such claims. This rifle felt ultimate, eternal, hardly a stepping stone. Schaefer inspected the en-bloc clip once more. 8 rounds, simple insertion. He admired how it rejected overthinking, no delicate magazines to dent, no complex feeding systems, just a leap of engineering insight, faster reloads, faster return to battle. He imagined a factory worker in America placing clips into crates by the thousands. He saw ships crossing oceans, carrying weapons that promised every soldier a fighting chance. Kruger recalled a factory assignment years earlier. Germany excelled at craftsmanship, perfection over quantity, but war demanded numbers. The United States, with vast industry, forged rifles like harvest. Every new weapon meant another man ready to stand firm. The contrast gnawed at him. Perhaps Germany had been arrogant, trusting skill over scale, artistry over pragmatism. Now, the bill came due. They agreed the rifle's sights represented unseen genius, fully adjustable yet sturdy. A soldier could zero quickly, whether shooting across a field or down a village street. German rifles offered precision but demanded careful training. The Garand offered grace to every farm boy drafted from Missouri cornfields. This democratization of lethality terrified them. After midday, they tested the rifle again. A target, an abandoned wagon, waited across a muddy courtyard. Schaefer squeezed 8 shots, smooth and swift. Wood splintered, wheels collapsed. The familiar ping echoed. Another soldier, younger and full of doubt, tried next. His groupings were wide, but still faster than anything he could attempt with a K-98K, the men murmured. Fear and admiration touched their voices. Talk drifted toward captured American letters. They revealed casual pride. Soldiers joked about their rifles, cleaned them nightly, and trusted them implicitly. These letters spoke of reliable weapons, steady supply, and belief that each man mattered. German letters felt different. They held despair, hunger, factory shortages. The rifle symbolized a deeper truth. America possessed not only power, but confidence. Inside the church, a young corporal opened the Garand's bolt. He imagined himself an American. He pictured battles across oceans, where soldiers carried stories rather than superstition. He wondered if they fought for ideals rather than orders. The rifle seemed to answer, both. Evening came. Shadows stretched, and smoke drifted from distant towns. The unit prepared to move. They rapped the rifle again, aware that their journey neared its end. Rumors circulated that Allied breakthroughs threatened their line. Some whispered evacuation, others braced for final stands. Schaefer believed the rifle would be studied for decades, a holy relic of industrial skill. As they marched, distant gunfire echoed. Every crack sounded like the Garand. Fear tightened their hearts. They imagined waves of American infantry approaching calm, disciplined, armed with rifles that turned average soldiers into relentless forces. They pictured men charging through hedgerows, trusting the metal in their hands. Night settled. They chose a farmhouse for shelter. Inside, they shared stories. North, Africa, Sicily, Normandy. Battles lost not only to strategy but to technology. They tried to dismiss defeat as fate, yet the Garand sat quietly, reminding them that history favored innovation. Its silence spoke louder than any speech. It said, "Adapt or fall." Schaefer slept last. He wrote in his journal, noting that war had taught him humility. He felt the M1 Garand represented a turning point. For Germany, a lesson. For the world, a future. He closed his book, whispering that progress had chosen its champion. Then, exhausted, he dreamed of peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.